Hey, you're listening to Can I Say That? With Brenna and Austin Blaine.
Hey guys, it's Brenna. This week on the show, I got to sit down with Joshua Harris, who is a writer, storytelling coach, and speaker. He owns Clear and Loud Marketing and Brand Strategy Company and lives in Vancouver, BC. But if you grew up as a Christian, especially in the 90s, early 2000s, you might know Joshua Harris because of the book he wrote called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. I remember being 12 years old and I walked into my bedroom and I saw this book sitting on my pillow. And I think my brother had read it before me when he was younger. And I remember looking at the book and knowing that I knew people in my life who read this book and then they quit dating. And I was very determined that would not happen to me. And so I took the book and I marched downstairs and I gave it back to my parents. And I said, thanks, but no thanks. And honestly, I don't even know why. That's so out of character for me to be defiant about something. But anyways, I digress. I am really excited for you guys to hear today's interview because if you know anything about Joshua Harris or about the purity culture movement, even within Christianity, you know that so much has changed over the last 20 years. And like a lot of things in the evangelical circles here in America, there are some things that we as Christians really need to stop and reevaluate. Why do we view this a certain way, or why do we hold certain standards, and are these things even biblical? If you've kept up with Josh Harris or you don't even know who that is, you'll hear today he has a really interesting perspective on purity culture and just Christian culture as a whole because of his background and where he is now. So today might be a challenging listen for some of you, and I would really encourage you to lean in. Write down some of the questions you have. Find someone who you trust to have a conversation with, or even feel free to email or DM us here at Can I Say That? Hey Josh, how's it going?
It's going great. How are you?
I'm good. So today we're talking about purity culture, and a lot of our listeners, their first question was, what actually is the definition of purity culture and what did it come out of? And is there any biblical basis for this belief that kind of, exploded in the 90s?
Wow, that's a lot of questions that your listeners have. Oh, well, I guess the first thing I would say is that people ask me about this because I wrote a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye some 20 years ago that became a really important book in shaping that environment that is now referred to as purity culture. It wasn't called purity culture at the time. But there was a huge emphasis on purity. So I'm asked about it because I wrote that book, and because I've reevaluated and basically recanted my views in that book. But I don't necessarily consider myself an expert in terms of critiquing that. And there are a lot of, I think, more articulate, better voices, especially for coming from women, to be quite honest, who are talking about the effects of purity culture, kind of the problems with it, the negative impact of it, and so on. So I guess I just would want to encourage people to dig a little bit deeper and go beyond my thoughts and reflections on it. And then the other thing that I would say is that since I wrote that book and since I changed my mind about that book, I've also talked publicly about the fact that, my views of faith are evolving, changing. I'm not in the church right now. I don't know exactly where I'm going to land with that in the days to come. But that's sort of like a full disclosure statement to say I'm not necessarily approaching this from a traditional evangelical Christian perspective now, saying, well, here's where it's biblical, here's where it's not, here's what's bad or negative. I'm really coming from a quite different perspective. So I think that I'd want to inform people of let the listener beware is what I'd want to say. But the big picture answer to the question is that purity culture was shaped by teaching and movements like True Love Waits that were based in different denominations. It was shaped by a reaction to the sexual liberation, free love movement of the 1960s, where a lot of Christians started making a big emphasis of sexual purity, saving sex for marriage, modesty, and those ideas then evolved into going even further, which my book was a part of doing, in saying, well, if we want to avoid sexual, sex before marriage, then we should be concerned about emotional attachments, and we should be concerned about the problems with dating and all those types of things. And so the real issue, I think, is that it created a hyper focus on sexuality as kind of a key measurement of being right with God. It made a big focus of the concept of purity, which is something you can lose, and virginity and those types of ideas. And I think the effect was people feeling that they couldn't measure up, people's views of sex being greatly shaped by this, people not dating, all these types of ideas, which now many people are looking back 15, 20 years later and saying these ideas and this focus and this emphasis really negatively shaped my views of sex. It negatively affected my marriage, how I approached things, who I married, what happened in our sex life after we got married, all those kinds of things. And to be fair, there are also many people who would look back and say, I'm glad I did what I did. I'm grateful that I saved sex for marriage, and purity culture was positive for me. So there's really a lot of debate and conversation that's taken place around this. And then I think another piece of this is that in the 20 years since this took place, there's been a massive evolution in the way people think about the LGBTQ community, and that community, I think, was uniquely harmed by purity culture in different ways. So that's kind of a synopsis.
What was like the catalyst or the motivation behind you writing I Kissed Dating Goodbye? Like, why did you want to write about this subject passionately as you did?
Well, I think I was trying to make peace with the strong teaching that I was getting from the True Love Waits movement, something that was being taught in our youth group about saving sex for marriage. But then I was seeing so many of my friends not save sex for marriage. I was in a relationship where my girlfriend and I were going further and further physically, and I felt guilt around that. And then when we broke up, I felt guilt around how I'd hurt her. My parents were, encouraging me to read Elizabeth Elliot's Passion and Purity. And so I was kind of like hearing all these different ideas and then dealing with a secular world that was obviously encouraging, sexual activity and all of that. And so I Kissed Dating Goodbye was sort of my trying to make sense of it all and raise a high standard for myself and please the Lord and honor him. And, seeing the heartbreak that I saw among my friends, my kind of youthful zeal was expressed by saying, well, if we really want to honor God, if saving sex for marriage is this important, if it's this damaging to have sex before marriage and give your heart away and so on, then we need to be even more radical. And I Kissed Dating Goodbye was the rallying cry.
What was it like to gain, such a huge following at such a young age surrounding this topic of purity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was overwhelming. I think it was exciting. I thought that I was doing what God wanted me to do. I thought it was a sign that, the message was from God. And I heard from so many people who, were so frustrated by dating, who'd been hurt in relationships, and were taking my message and being like, oh, I'm so glad I'm not the only one. This makes so much sense. And so I then moved to a church and started being trained in a church that had been practicing these kind of ideas since the, late 70s. And so it was just reinforced. So all my ideas just reinforced and added fuel to that. And so it felt like it was, exciting and great. And I was getting to be a leader and getting to be a voice for these things. Of course, I view that very differently now. But when I was 21, 22, it was exciting.
Was it difficult to live out, this message that you're preaching of purity while you're continuing to get all this attention from this book as a young man?
No, I don't think it was. It was difficult. I mean, I was fairly shielded. I was traveling and doing conferences and so on, but I ended up getting into a relationship with my future wife at that time, and so I was in a local church and I was courting this girl, and all of that was taking place, and so I didn't have any problem kind of sticking to the standards that I was loading on other people.
So, as you've already said, your ideas around purity culture have shifted a lot, especially, maybe with your shift in faith. What was the moment for you that you started to doubt, this purity culture movement or doubt the ideas that you wrote about in your book?
Well, it was an unfolding process. I started to hear negative feedback. I mean, I got negative feedback on the book immediately, but there was such an overwhelming response, positive and negative, that instead of really carefully listening to that and contemplating it, I just kind of chalked it up to, well, of course, there are going to be haters out there, and there are good reviews on Amazon and there are negative reviews, and these people just aren't serious about God, et cetera. And then what happened was, I got married and moved into pastoring and starting a family and so on. And I didn't experience firsthand the environment that my book, fostered and created. So I wasn't single experiencing that, experiencing like the extra levels of weirdness and awkwardness that were created by not dating and, all those types of things. And so, I, to my shame, I didn't listen to that critique, as quickly as I should have. And it took my church going through a big crisis and beginning to see tendencies of legalism and ways people were hurt by that for me to start saying, wait a second, did my book contribute to this, to these kinds of legalistic problems and so on? And so it really wasn't until I stepped away from being a pastor to take a extended sabbatical and go to a graduate school of theology, go to a seminary in Vancouver, BC in Canada, that I had the kind of breathing room to start listening to different voices. And I was a student and I was talking to fellow students, and they started to share stories with me about how my book had hurt them. And these were just things that I hadn't really, I'd always been the pastor that needed to kind of defend the positions and that type of thing. And so that was really the beginning of listening. And as I started to listen, I started interacting with people online, and there were many people who had been critiquing Ike Stadium-Abai and purity culture online, and I just had not engaged with them. And as I started to engage with them, I was encountering real human beings with real stories, and I began to, I decided to kind of engage in this lengthy process of reevaluating the book because I didn't want to be quick about it. I didn't want to give just a quick answer, but it was that process which involved, a team of people. We decided to film a documentary to capture it. We invited people to share their stories. It was like hundreds and hundreds of interactions. And the consistency of experience across the country from different ages of people, the depth of pain that people experienced from the effect of these ideas, the long-term consequences of them because they affected who they married and how they viewed relationships and sex, was really so powerful and so heartbreaking in some cases. And again, I would just say diverse. They're different stories. Some people are super positive about these ideas. And I mean, I don't view it the same way as they do, but I want to honor their perspective. And it was that process that really made me say, there's something really, I think, wrong with the way that this book was communicated, the content of the book, the idea of the book. And I didn't know where that process would end, but it ended with me asking my publisher to discontinue the book and unpublish the book and apologizing for it to people, which, is too little too late and doesn't doesn't fix anything, but it was an attempt to say, I hear you, I see that I was wrong, and I don't want to stand behind these ideas anymore.
Do you feel like you got some freedom in that process of, doing the documentary and walking through all that with all these people? Do you feel like, was it something you moved from being scared and nervous about, or was it always this process that you're pretty eager to walk into?
No, I think I definitely felt so much more free afterwards. I think I'd been terrified to open up that door of reevaluation because I didn't know where it would lead. It had been such a big part of my identity. Like I was a best-selling author because of Ike Stating Goodbye. I was this person who, had these ideas that had helped all these people, and so to then transform that perspective and say, this thing that you thought was this great accomplishment, no, actually, it hurt a lot of people. It had these negative ramifications, and to let go of that was really hard for me. But it was also liberating to be able to say, I don't have to keep defending this. I can admit that I was wrong. Yeah, I'm so grateful that I was able to do that. But along the way, it was a painful, scary process.
I'm really curious. I mean, I want to move away from purity culture now because I just think you have such a unique perspective about the church and Christian culture. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on Christian culture overall? And like, if you could change a few things about Christian culture or the church, what would those things be and why?
Oh, that's a tricky question, Brenna. Why don't you go first? What would you change about Christian culture? I want to hear what you would say.
Oh gosh. I would want people to be less defensive, and I want the church to be able to have more conversations without having to feel like they have to defend everything. I feel like the church isn't always the best at listening, and because of that, it deeply affects people who not only are not Christians, but people who are also on the fringe of Christianity, who are, maybe curious about who this person of Jesus is, but
Yeah,
there's something in their way, and the church isn't able to get around that roadblock.
that's really well said. I think that's really good. I think that's a good insight. I agree with that. I think it's difficult because obviously I'm at a place where I have stepped away from the church. I'm trying not to define myself as a this or a that, now, um, and box myself in. I want to be open to, new expressions of belief and faith and so on. But right now, that's kind of just not where I am. So answering that question about what you change about the church when you're like doubting and questioning key like beliefs is such a tricky thing. So I mean, I do think that obviously the way Christians live is shaped by their beliefs. Sometimes I think their culture and the way that they live is in contradiction to Christian beliefs. So that's like a different question. It's like, live like Jesus and everything will be better, that kind of thing. But then I also want to acknowledge that sometimes I have, questions and real concerns about the teachings of the Bible and the things that are, I think, very clear in Scripture being a part of the problem, in terms of shaping the culture that's negative. So the easy answer is, you're just not living like Jesus. You're being like the Pharisees. So if you just stop doing that, everything will be fine. The harder answer, which I think is much more problematic for the church, is maybe some of the actual beliefs that are rooted in orthodoxy and church history are the problem. So that's there kind of two levels to the conversation. But what I would say is just that one of my biggest concerns for any faith community, but especially Christianity, because that's what I've been raised in and have believed for so many years, is that when you start to be controlling and manipulative to people to force them to live in a certain way, I think it's extremely damaging. I don't think that it helps them to be healthy disciples. Number one. So it's like what you produce by getting people to stay and be controlled isn't healthy. Um, but then it also just, I think, causes a lot of harm to people. And I think it keeps people from wanting to explore, there being truth and reality underneath the practices and the culture, because it's just so off-putting. And so I've wrestled with that. I came from a church where, we preached grace, we preached the centrality of the gospel and so on. But the culture that we had was built on certain practices, performance, not dating, homeschooling your kids, whatever. Add to the list, and more practices and more kind of opinions became essential and central to the gospel. So for example, our very conservative viewpoints of women could not be pastors. Ideally they would just be, mothers at home, wives at home, kind of a thing. All those kinds of things became this expression of, well, if you're not faithful to gender roles, then you're not faithful to, God's relationship, Christ's relationship to the church, which is central to the gospel. So if you stray on, women being pastors, you're deviating from the gospel. So it's like these other secondary issues got lumped into the center, and there became more and more things that you had to believe and practice rightly. And I was a pastor in that, and I contributed to that environment of control where, if your kids aren't doing well, then you're not a good parent. If your wife is, working and has a career, then you're less committed to, the home, and, all those types of things. And so it's so subtle, but it's so powerful. And that environment creates people who are terrified of being rejected if they do things wrong, who, really can have trauma from the way religion can function in those ways. And so that really saddens me.
Is there any encouragement or advice that you have for people who are maybe in a similar boat to you, who have, decided, I don't know if Christianity is where I'm going to land, and they're kind of in this area of exploring, but they have this background of Christianity? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I would just say that there's no one way to do things. My experience ended up being very public for personal reasons. I felt that I needed to do that because my Christian life had been so public, but I don't think other people have to be so public about what they do. I would just encourage you to kind of process things yourself, listen to new voices. There are probably even just other Christians that you've never listened to because they were dangerous or you weren't allowed to, or whatever it might be. Our church was so controlling in the way that we kind of censored any book that wasn't, even popular Christian books that we didn't think were as doctrinaire as they needed to be. They weren't allowed in the bookstore. We controlled everybody's kind of reading diet. We discouraged people from having their own, Bible studies. We would just listen to the pastors and take our teaching, that kind of thing. And so I just would say, step away from that kind of spirit of control where other people are saying you can only think this and you can only read this and you can only engage these ideas, and go easy on yourself. It's a hard process to rethink question things, and it's a mind-blowing process. It can be overwhelming. And so I just would be really gentle with yourself. And if you can find a conversation partner or people who you trust that you can engage with on these things, I think that's fantastic. What's so awesome about the internet is that there are resources out there where you can access podcasts, and you can engage with other people who are all over the map in their process of taking apart their beliefs and trying to piece them back together, or not piecing them back together. And so just don't feel like you have to be rushed to figure it out. And I would also say, don't feel rushed to kind of find a new dogmatic stance. I see a lot of people that go from, being dogmatic with their evangelicalism to being dogmatic in their atheism or whatever, and I would just say, really kind of be careful, because you've learned ways of thinking and relating to life and to truth that might not serve you, even as you change your perspective. Just like give yourself some space.
Before we end, going back to purity culture, for those who are interested, what is your documentary called and where can people find it?
Yeah, the documentary was produced and directed by a really talented lady named Jessica Vander Weingard. She has made the film available for free on YouTube through her company Doxology. So if you just Google "I Survived, I Kissed Dating Goodbye" documentary, or just search for that on YouTube, you'll find the full documentary that you can watch. It's also available on Amazon Prime. If you have Amazon Prime, you can watch it for free there as well. So I'd love for people to watch it and engage with it. And when I filmed the documentary, I had not kind of deconstructed, in terms of my faith. So it's really me coming from a Christian perspective, asking, about the effect of the book and talking to people and getting, different perspectives. So it was a really important journey for me. And I hope people enjoy watching it.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you want to learn more about Can I Say That?, our guests on the show, or submit questions and participate in polls, please join us on Instagram at Can I Say That Show. We love interacting with our audience and hearing how this show has affected, changed, and challenged you in your own walk. So please join us.